Thank you, Peter. So Neil, Benoit, and I agreed that we're not going to give long introductions to the speakers. We could give very long introductions to the speakers, but we figured we will keep them short because you'd rather hear from them than hear us talking about them. It gives me great joy to introduce Rebecca Henderson, who's the John and Natty McArthur University Professor at Harvard, where that university professor thing, of course, is a really big deal. She's an organizational economist, done a lot of research on innovation, relational contracts, and mission-driven firms. And in a lot of her work, especially in recent years, has been thinking at a systemic and societal level about the roles and responsibilities of businesses in society. Probably best known for her 2020 book on this topic, Reimagining Capitalism in a World on Fire. So with that, I will hand it over to Rebecca.
Good afternoon. I'm honored and delighted to be here. Professor Kreps, my congratulations. It's wonderful to see you. I was on the faculty here in academic year 93, 94. Was it 94, 95? Anyway. I'm good. Okay. I was on the faculty here in 93, 94, and one of my great pleasures was the lunch meetings we sometimes have with Professor Kreps. So thank you. There's very good times in my memory. I am here to talk about ethics in a world on fire. And I'm a bit nervous about this talk for a number of reasons. One is because I have no formal training in ethics. I led the ethics course at the Harvard Business School, and that gave me sort of a rough and ready grounding, but I have no academic training in the discipline. And the second reason I'm nervous about this is that I am going to be playing fast and loose with ideas that I believe are derived from the social psychological and psychological literature. And I also have no training in these disciplines. So what the heck am I doing on this stage, and why am I talking about these issues? Well, I'm here because I'm obsessed with climate change. And in particular, with the question of why we, and when I say we, I mean those of us who are privileged, highly educated, largely white, largely in the West, why we have not done more about this. Why we are slowly moving towards catastrophe. Very strange. So that's been the focus of my work for the last 20 years, with a particular focus on what the private sector can do. And it's led me to engage quite closely with these issues of ethics and psychology. So that's what I want to talk about. So, great. So, as I said, my background in ethics, such as it is, was teaching and leading the leadership and corporate accountability at HBS. 10 faculty, about 1,000 students, 24 cases, a focus on really 3 issues. What are your legal responsibilities? The students call it the don't go to jail class. What are your ethical responsibilities? Focusing overwhelmingly on deontology and utilitarianism, Kant and Bentham. And a little bit about the social, psychological, and behavioral literatures, which is be careful, your immediate intuitions may not be correct. So that's my background. I enjoyed teaching the course enormously, but I found it unsatisfactory in a couple of important ways. I'm really getting no joy from this clicker. Great. Okay. My work in climate change has led me to believe that, yes, ethics is about the nature of the good. So totally down with Kant and Bentham. Not a problem. But I believe ethics is also, thank you, wrong clicker, ethics is also structural. That is that too much of what we were teaching at Harvard took the structural arrangements for granted, took the nature of the relationship between business and government, the kinds of incentives that constrain finance, completely for granted. And we were telling the students, given your constraints, how do you behave ethically? But I've got really deeply interested in, should you not also be thinking about the constraints? These constraints are continuously recreated by the actors in the system. Saying it's all fixed, to my mind, was not satisfactory. And the second issue I became deeply, deeply engaged in was this question about ethics also being relational and embedded. So we have, and again, I'm right over the edge here, but we have a deep Western tradition of ethics is about you sit in your office, you think carefully about the dilemma, you introduce the frameworks, you choose the right answer. And it ain't like that when you're out there. It just isn't. Ethics is often about your gut, your heart, your intuition, your moral intuition. And indeed, I got into this because my moral intuition said burning down the planet is a really bad idea. And that gives me enormous power and drive. And so what's that about? Is it useful? How do we think about it? What might it mean? So what do I mean by structural ethics? So we teach our students that they have a duty to maximize investor or shareholder value, that doing so maximizes public welfare, broadly Friedman, but many papers written in that area, and that managers are agents for their investors and have a duty to manage on their behalf. Very straightforward. I suspect many of you have taught that or are broadly familiar with these ideas. This belief has very deep roots in contract theory, in welfare and price theory, in agents theory, and also a kind of, in the background, never precisely modeled, but a deep belief that markets are more compatible with individual freedom than is state control. So maximizing shareholder value is not only your legal responsibility, it is your moral duty, because the price system is so efficient, because maximizing profits maximizes public welfare under some conditions. What we really know is it's Pareto efficient, which is a little bit different from welfare maximizing. But we think competitive markets are fully Pareto efficient. And because to do anything else is to betray your responsibility to your investors. Don't play with their money. Good. So it's often viewed as a legal requirement and a moral duty. Moreover, and I have more than 20 years experience on large public boards, including on Amgen here in California, maximizing profits turns out to be like a necessity because it's a problem. If you're not making money, you're not surviving and you're going to get fired. So a lot of maximizing shareholder value is that too. And of course, you stand to make a great deal of money. But depending on your interpretation of fiduciary duty, and I have spent weeks and days and years on this with lawyers, while it is almost certainly illegal to announce that you're about to reduce shareholder value, except in a few well-defined conditions, which are all to do with takeover legislation, so on, takeover regulation, we could talk about it. In fact, you have no legal duty to maximize shareholder value in the short term. You are absolutely legally okay to say, we are going to paint every building on our biotech campus yellow and insist people play basketball on Friday afternoon and take yoga classes because we are completely convinced it will increase shareholder value in the long term. So that's one issue. It's like it's not a tighter cage as we sometimes tell the students, or the students sometimes believe it is. If you have the confidence of your investors, you can do almost anything if you're making enough money. Point two. This is the kind of chart you do on the airplane and forget to come back to. Pareto efficiency brings no guarantee of utility optimization. And what's supposed to be on this slide is the chart showing that the top 1% have almost all of the recent gains in economic growth, and the top percent have even more than that. So while shareholder value optimization might be Pareto efficient, there's no guarantee it's welfare maximizing. And this for me is, so that's the distribution problem, right? No question about distribution in the core theory. And this is the question about externalities. And indeed, all the legal conditions that have to be in place for markets to be fully competitive, which, as you know, are quite comprehensive. So externalities have to be properly priced, everyone has to be able to play, there has to be no collusion, and firms cannot pay to distort the rules in their own favor. Because if these conditions do not hold, there is absolutely no condition, no guarantee that maximizing shareholder value will maximize the things we care about. What it will maximize is the wealth of the people who own the companies. If I can pay to have the rules that prevent me dumping waste into the river inoperative, I will dump the waste. And the market is not properly priced. So, one big question for me is, how should we think about firms' participation in the political system? What should we be teaching about it? And in principle, this is what we hope is going on. In principle, the US is a constitutional democracy. Free markets, genuine competition, free information, free entry, free exit, externalities priced, is dependent on free politics. And free politics, again, one could say an enormous amount there, but in principle, free politics means that even if in the economic sphere people are unequal, because some people work harder and are luckier than others, in the political sphere, everyone is a valued member of the body politic. Everyone's vote counts, everyone has the information. It is a genuine democracy. And this is, I believe, the sort of basic contract, the basic social contract of the United States and of many democracies, that markets and government balance each other. We don't want the market out of control, and we don't want the political system out of control. Don't want dictatorship, don't want oligarchy. So what maintains that balance? Civil society, rule of law, a free press, universities really acting as guardians of truth, and some kind of voice for labor. Now, forgive me those of you who have written endless learned papers about this, but I mention it because in our basic ethics course, we were not teaching it. And it's like super important, right? Because if you have a massive economic incentive to destabilize the democracy, or even just to subvert, to destroy any voice for labor and to make sure that the free press never criticizes you, you are playing with the underlying structure of the society. And that has ethical implications. Here's a case. This is an actual case. Those of you who want to teach it, let me know. This is the case of Phillips 66 and the Washington state carbon tax. Now, one of the reasons I chose Phillips 66 is the CEO was on the board of Amgen with me, so I know him well. He is a delightful and deeply moral person. And he runs Phillips 66, spent his life building it. In 2018, Phillips 66 was the largest supplier of fossil fuels in Washington state. That same year, following an extensive multi-stakeholder process, the state proposed a carbon tax of $15 a ton on CO2. Washington state was one of the lowest emissions per head of any state in the union, and they wished to continue that process. The tax was projected to raise $1 billion a year at a cost to consumers of $10 a month. Fossil fuel sales in the state were projected to fall as a result by 40%. Phillips 66, both now and at the time, acknowledged the reality of climate change and indeed was proud of their sustainability credentials. But spending $1 million would almost certainly lead to the defeat of the tax. And in the case, we have a lot of background on how much you need to spend and how you spend it. But it's quite clear, you spend enough money, it goes away. So the issue in the case is, should you spend the money? I think it's quite clear what the answer would be if you focused only on maximizing shareholder value. Spend the money. They spent the money. The initiative, which had been previously supported by 50% of the population, with 25% unopposed and another 25% undecided, went down to defeat. Is this okay behavior? I'm not sure. I don't personally have a strong feeling. I have a strong moral intuition that it's terrible and they should do something different. But would I tell the students that it's unethical to spend the money? on what basis would I tell them? I think there's a big issue here in how we teach and think about ethics that I would, love to know more about, love, support, and talk about. But for me, there's a big unanswered question. So here's the question. How should we think about spending that, for example, at random, supports a political party that begins to systematically destroy the institutions of civil society and the institutions of state, just for fun? How should we think about that question? It's kind of key, right? I don't think they're having that conversation in the ethics classroom at HBS today. I think we should be. Should we be giving our students tools to think about this class of problems? We absolutely should. And it's students' tools, not student tools. As you can tell, this is fresh. Okay, so idea number 2. So, we're okay with structural ethics? At least you have some sense of what I'm trying to say. I'm trying to move fast enough that we'll have time for questions, okay? But that's the first idea. Okay, I have one other idea. The other idea is we should explore what I'm calling embedded ethics, or might call our moral intuitions, which again, and I'm going to keep doing this in the presentation, and I have a request of those of you in this room who teach social psychology or psychology, which is, as I say, egregiously foolish things, or clearly have not read the right literature, or even are mildly off track. Would you please come up to me afterwards and say, Rebecca, here's the list, read this. Because here's what I'm going to say. I'm going to say that much of the psychology in the ethics classroom is of the form, you are going to make a mistake. It's sort of got a trolley problem flavor to it, or a Milgram problem flavor to it, both of which, of course, we teach in our ethics course. It's sort of, don't really trust your mind. Sit down, get a lot of people in the room. Is it Kant? Is it Bentham? Go through it, do the discussion. Psychology, all that squishy, emotional, reactive stuff, bad idea. And I'm going to suggest that that might be problematic. Why? Because my deep belief, and this comes from 20 years of studying change in large corporations and another 20 studying climate change, is people don't do stuff because they did Kant or Bentham. They do stuff because it feels right. And if it makes money and keeps them out of trouble, then they really do it. But really, they're relying on their moral intuitions all the time. I sat in the boardroom of a major pharmaceutical company whose name you're temporarily going to forget. And we talked about how much should we spend on basic R&D. And cone of silence. There's no way to calculate how much spending on basic R&D will drive shareholder value 15 years from now. There's no way. You choose a number. How do you choose the number? You choose the number because you really care about improving patient health, and you're excited about some of the science, and the central mission of the company is making a difference in the world. And I'm proud of that. Now, don't get me wrong. I don't think we spent egregiously too much. I don't think we threw money out of the window. I'm just saying that that decision is so much more complicated than the cash flow diagram. And a huge component of that decision is people's moral beliefs about what is important and their role in the world. And so I think we should, at least talk about it in the classroom and maybe bring as much research as we can to talking about it in a sensible way. So, what do I mean? Ethics are embedded, and again, I suspect this won't be new to anyone in the room, in our bodies and minds. But a lot in our bodies, right? We know, for example, that one of the key ethical moral intuitions is about disgust. Some things are disgusting. That's very much a visceral feeling, often in the gut. Can't do that. It's disgusting. It's inappropriate. It's an ethical feeling. But sometimes it's in our hearts. Sometimes it's in the joy we feel. And it's also, of course, I love that you can just put a single sentence on the slide and it's in the culture. My friend and colleague Robert Gibbons always says culture, the word you use when you want to stop thinking. It's in our culture, it's in our institutions, it's in our norms, it's everywhere. Everything we do is shot through with implicit ethical understandings about what's appropriate behavior and what is not. So I think that's important. So just to make the point, you get a reaction? Of course you get a reaction. Not good. You know, people jump into lakes, they run into burning buildings, they do all kinds of crazy things. You see that, I hope you run into the room and grab the guy. Like, you don't think. It's just wrong. It's wrong, it's wrong, it's wrong. So, unpacking these kinds of moral intuitions is complex. Again, yeah, like no kidding. There's no strong evidence for a universal morality. We know that moral intuitions vary across times and places and classes and cultures. But some intuitions are relatively consistent. Harming children is nearly always considered to be a super bad idea. Killing other humans, nearly always considered to be a super bad idea. But no universal morality. But most human groups have strong shared intuitions and have real effects on behavior. And again, just to tiptoe up to our current moment, one way of understanding what's happening now is that the country is split between groups that have strong moral intuitions that at least they're experiencing as contrary to each other. So it's not only nice lefty people who have strong moral intuitions, people we sometimes deeply disagree with also have very strong moral intuitions. But this seems to be part of teaching ethics. So, this is a question. Is one of the reasons that our society is in such distress that our elites no longer appear to share or to be interested in acting on the moral intuitions of the rest of us? And by our elites, I mean very precisely here the people running the world's major corporations and controlling the money. We are living in a world in which, when the Conservative government in England, and I am English as you might be able to tell, decided to privatise the Thames Water, which was the water supply for southern England, they sold it to an Australian private equity firm that pulled many hundreds of billions of dollars out of the company, failed to invest in maintenance or upgrades, and within a few years was discharging raw sewage into the rivers of England. Like, I know morality is relative, but this is weird, no? Doesn't this strike you like as not a good idea? But they walked away for the money, completely legal, completely legal. Oh, they said, bad regulations, you should have updated the regulations. Like, not okay. Perhaps you're familiar with what happened after the CEO of United Healthcare was shot. Yes? What happened? People started tweeting about their healthcare experiences. They started telling about the times their partners were dying and their claims were refused. This is a real thing. The perception that those with the money do not give a toss has at least some basis in reality. On average, the data is tricky, but this number we think is pretty good. My husband does healthcare. About 10% of healthcare claims are refused. As you know, the major cause of bankruptcy in the United States is healthcare bills. People lose their houses, they lose their partners. We know there are doctors who recommend medical treatment and the patients say, I can't lose the house, we don't know it will be approved, leave without treatment. So I just instance this to say maybe this is a big deal at the heart of our system, is that some of our students have gone out into the world and they think it's just about making money. It's not all of them. Everyone in this room knows business people with deep moral intuitions who are committed to building a great society. All of us know people like that. There are people not quite like that, and they're giving the rest a bad name. So understanding what's going on feels to me important. And of course, this is my big issue. Are we really going to let the planet burn? Like, really? Really? Because we want 8% return on our capital instead of 5? Or maybe it's 6 instead of 3. This is a choice we made. I've been doing climate for about 20 years. 15 years ago, and I really thought we would just fix this. Not a problem. Technology, pathways, clear. Would have cost about 3% of GDP. Yes, it's a global governance problem. Yes, it's a long-term problem. But we don't think employing children as labor is a good idea. We have solved long-term problems. We have the rule of the sea. We couldn't do it. Didn't do it. What is going on? So here's where I need backup from those of you who really know this literature. I'm going to ask, have we over-indexed on rationality and separation? Have we over-indexed on what the neuroscientists call the executive control mode? The piece of us that's super good at solving problems, that thinks in pieces, that's deeply rational, is sure it's right, thinks that it's separate and independent from everything else and could just go to Mars and it would be fine, is not comfortable with emotions, deeply heady, and learns through models. Now, this executive control mode, this is, of course, one way of thinking about the major achievement of Western civilization, the Enlightenment. One way of thinking about really getting down with the problem solving and really solving problems. It's been a huge source of power and strength in our society for at least 300 years. But in that process, the other way, or another way that humans operate, which is sometimes called the default mode, has been sort of pushed to the side. So what is the default mode? The default mode, in some circles, this is called left and right brain, which is really the wrong way to call it, but you might have heard it called it that way. But the default mode, it thinks it's in wholes, it's deeply relational, deeply intuitive, it loves music, it loves patterns, it feels part of something greater to itself, open to emotions, very embodied, very comfortable in the body. It learns through stories. And most of us have access to both modes, right? Sometimes we call the left-hand side work self and the right-hand side home self. Depending on the nature of your relationship, maybe one partner is an executive control type and the other partner is a default type. You know, I'm pretty much executive control all the way down. So you might think I was married to a Brazilian who loves dancing, is deeply spontaneous, just is continually saying, Rebecca, would you chill out and slow down? And yes, I am. And he's lovely. But it's a different way of being. And my question is, particularly in business schools, but in universities more broadly, have we focused on the left? Because that's what we're good at, right? Get really good, get really deep, do the abstraction. And here's the dark side. I mean, I could just put this up and say, let's teach our students to be balanced. You know, that's the answer. Let's make them aware that they have these two sides and let's help them dance with these sides. But it's darker than that. It's darker and harder than that. Why? Because, as a generality, we tend to think of the executive control mode as male, as sophisticated. All that default mode stuff, all that dancing in the moonlight, not really. It's cognitive and we love thinking. And it's secular. And we don't like talk of the transcendental or the religious or the spiritual. And again, I'm using the we of this room. We don't talk about that. And so the default mode gets labeled as largely female, primitive, emotional, and yuck, spiritual. And my apologies to those of you from the faith traditions. I'm talking in generalities here, and particularly about the educated elite in the West. Well, this is a problem because all these words in certain contexts have significantly negative connotations. So we've sort of taken the default mode and pushed it away. We've said the way to be in the world is on your own, strong and rational. And that all that other stuff, we kind of got beyond that. Don't need that stuff. Now, the good news is humans have practiced activating the default mode for thousands of years, right? This used to be integral and is still integral to many, many cultures and many classes that haven't lost this. So all the individual practices, art, music, poetry, gratitude, awe, being in nature, lots and lots of evidence that these practices actively shift our moods, the way we behave, the structure of our minds. And this is key, this is not just about doing it on your own. To really activate the default mode, you must do it in groups, because it's all about relationality. And the thing about the default mode when it's full on is it helps you take other people's welfare as central as your own, and it helps you focus on the long term. This is what the great wisdom traditions in the world have said for thousands of years, that focusing just on yourself, just on the abstract, just on the short term is deeply unskillful. It's a mistake. It makes you really unhappy. And when we look back, I can't do this. When we look back, indeed, I think it's the case that humans that have ceased doing any of this are really unhappy. And of course, I know you know this, but what's happening with the fragmentation of attention and the focus on devices is pushing our kids into an executive control, dissociated, out of focus, unrelated mode. Because all of this takes time and energy. It's difficult. It's not the same thing as the kind of moral training that Aristotle advocated, but it's related, right? It's the training in being relational, the training in thinking about something larger than yourself, and engaging not just your brain, but your body and your spirit and your autonomic nervous system in thinking that way. Many psychologists suggest we can't live without it. That one of the reasons our society is so bumpy right now is because there's so little of this happening. Deeply problematic, especially among the wealthier and more successful. So, if we take this seriously, what would it mean for our teaching? So I have a few ideas. One is, I teach now by opening with mindfulness in every class, ending with poetry, and doing deep listening in every class. And I split the students into small groups, and I try and build community, and I try and teach them to be aware of who they are and what they're doing. And I recommend they do an individual practice every day. I don't care what, but something that centers the nervous system, that lets them slow down. So that seemed to me the most obvious thing to do. I read the research and I was like, okay, got to get that in the classroom like right now. But more concretely, could it persuade the private sector to double down on solving the climate crisis? That is, if we could activate the default mode, would that help people go like, what am I thinking? Of course, it's an ambiguous decision. I can choose to use solar panels instead of fossil fuels. Let's go. We know the policies required to hold warming to 1.7 degrees C. Fossil fuel consumption continues to grow. The current base case where we think we're heading is about 3.3 degrees by 2100. Forgive me, but that means that days above 28 degrees C wet bulb will become increasingly prevalent. Why 28 degrees wet bulb? Because this is the temperature at which you cannot work outside without dying. Wet bulb is 100% humidity. If it's at 28 degrees, the body breaks down. The dark red and lighter red areas are those areas of the world where this temperature is going to prevail from between 2 weeks and the entire year. Massive areas of the globe are currently predicted to become uninhabitable. And that includes all the good news you're familiar with, all the good news that next year 93% of installed capacity will be renewables, that batteries have fallen in cost dramatically. All that good news is in this projection. This is catastrophic for ourselves and for other species on the planet. Our ecosystems are collapsing. Since 1970, 73% of monitored wildlife populations have disappeared. We have no idea what this will do to our long-term food supply. So here's the question. If it were up to you, if you were in charge, would you spend 5 to 8% of global GDP to leave your grandchildren on a planet as livable as the one you inherited? Would you write that check? And I mean you. Because the top 1% consume 50% of the world's energy. Have you noticed the size of the cars on the drive? We are doing this. You know, this is not about going to India and saying you can't have a light bulb in the hut. Would you do that? I'm guessing everyone in this room would do that. Would you take a 10% income cut if you knew that it would address these problems? Of course you would. Of course you would. So why don't we see that in our systems? You know, we can do this without imposing massive costs on the poorest half of humanity. If any of you are curious, I'd be delighted to share with you papers on how this is eminently possible. Solving the problems does mean reducing consumption at the higher end, but not to levels that reduce happiness or security. So, there's a lot of money to be made here. I spent 20 years of my life looking at the business models for doing this. Happy to give you some of the 300 cases we have at HBS on this. I wrote a book, Reimagining Capitalism in a World on Fire. The book does not mention the default mode. The book is completely rational. I knew who I was writing to, totally from the executive control mode. There's a business case. Here's how we do it. Not a problem. 9 fantastic chapters of easy reading. All you need to do is create shared value, that is, use the business models that are win-win. When those fail, you build cooperation in the industry so that, for example, in steel and cement, there are active consortia trying to transition us to green steel and green cement. You have to rewire finance, but that's easy because the ownership of resources is so concentrated that climate risk cannot be diversified. Nice case study on the Japanese government pension fund, largest pool of private capital, of capital in the world apart from the American Social Security system, the leader of which came to believe he had a fiduciary duty to reduce climate change because that's what was going to get his pensioners. And then, of course, you have to rebuild our institutions because you need the rules to get everyone moving. So, you know, lovely. And I didn't call it activate the default mode in your organization. I called it embrace a purpose beyond profits. But I know now that this is what I meant. Because I believe every word I wrote, there is a business case for cutting emissions by at least 50%. And if we had real public-private partnerships, and there's some wonderful work done by Chuck Sable and David Vitor on what this can do, we could have the regulatory regimes that could move the whole world. But you have to want to do it. You have to want to take the risk and do the emotional work that comes with taking the risk and doing new things. I came to believe that there is a lot of evidence consistent with the idea that operating in this way is completely consistent with profitability. This is the stream of research that Ken was nice enough to refer to, written with my colleague Robert Gibbons. No reason to think that managing this way will reduce performance, rather the reverse. It is more work. Managing in a default mode is different from thinking of people as things you just manipulate. So, let me close. What does this imply for how we teach? Should we be teaching our students about inner development? This is a group of mostly psychologists desperately saying, hey, it's about shifting humans. It's not just about the tech. We've got to shift the humans as well. They have 5 steps and 6 steps underneath each of them. But it's not as if we don't know how to support humans in becoming more balanced, in more psychologically developed. We know. We know that practicing the virtues, operating from this part of you, has been fundamental to most major social movements, including the social movements we don't like so much, like the Tea Party, deeply morally driven. So, I'm not sure what we should teach, but I think these are good questions to be asking. And so, in closing, let me say, I believe ethics is about the nature of the good, absolutely, but it's also structural and it's also relational and embedded, and we should be teaching our students about all three. Thank you very much. So thank you very much for your attention. We now have 9 minutes and 51 seconds. If anyone has questions, and I won't vaporize at the end of the symposium, so I'll be around after that too. But any questions? Yes, Jenna.
Oh, sorry. Thank you.
Could you tell me who you are?
Oh, sorry. Armando Parecia. I'm a lowly postdoc in comparison to all the luminaries here.
So you're still doing actual work, yeah?
Well, I believe so. So I wanted to ask you what you think of one of the alternative analysis of the same problem that you have described. Actually, your fellow, also very renowned professor at Harvard, Sandel, has followed this critique, but I think Ross Dotto from the New York Times might have started the critique, which is the current elites don't feel that they have an obligation to everyone else. And the word that Sandel says is that the current elites think that the people at the bottom deserve where they are and deserve to stay there. And deserve no charity. So this seems to be a very different critique than they were not taking both sides.
It doesn't sound to me like a different critique. It sounds like different language for exploring a similar problem. Let me give you a third way of describing it, and then suggest that makes sense of the two you've mentioned. One way of thinking about what's happening is that we are caught in modernity. And that modernity was a way of being that prioritized accumulation and power and rationality above almost anything else, and deliberately commodified, not deliberately, it turned out it commodified mostly non-white people, some female people, and certainly the natural world. But basically, it was accompanied, and this is what I find so interesting about modernity, it was accompanied by the promise of prosperity for all. Everyone was going to be as rich as we were. We could cut down the forest, we could make people slaves, but one day, everyone would be as rich as we were. So, and what's happening now is modernity is falling apart. And so the really ugly aspects of it, which is people at the bottom, they never really counted. That was true in 17th century England, 18th century England, 19th century England. They don't really count. And we don't really have an obligation to them, because what's happened is modernity became disembedded from the body, from the ways of thinking that would have kept it controlled, and also from the great faith traditions and from any overarching sense of major obligation. Now, we could talk about whether the Victorians were really moral, but they believed at some level that they should be helping. There was an ethical frame that was in place to try and control some of these behaviors. That we've pretty much lost. And so why I'm pointing to the default mode is we're experiencing it at an individual level as well, which is nobody else matters. All that cares about is my mind. If my mind lives forever, everything lives forever. So it's all bound up in this really complicated way. I don't think you can tease out one explanation from another. And I think the solutions are going to happen at every level. So I'm not literally suggesting that the solutions to our problems as we all take up painting, it would have to be embedded in institutions, in ways of behaving, in something that might look like a spiritual or religious revival, which is a re-embrace of a sense of a different value and purpose for our society. Sorry, that was such a big question, so that was quick, but I hope that's at least helpful.
I think Roosevelt said that it died with George Bush Sr., so he thought it's much more recent.
Yes, no. No. I don't agree, but yeah.
I'm Natty. We know each other. Hello. So you started talking about teaching and the ethics course, and your first part was, how not to go to jail. So that part must have been very, very short. If you live in, Russia or China, you shouldn't annoy these two guys, Putin, Xi. If you live in most democracies that we know about, maybe the U.S. accepted right now, you won't go to jail, basically. As long as you determine the governance structure that will shield you and the enforcement is so poor, you won't go to jail. That's a fact of life because it's lawful but awful, or it's even unlawful, but you won't go to jail. So that's short. The question is then, your default mode is about your, people and themselves, but what about the politics? What about civic-minded leadership? What about, that, as opposed to, centering yourself and all of that in the business context?
Right. Forgive me. And maybe I should have done the two pieces of the talk in the other direction. The reason I think the individual shift is so important is because we enact the institutions all the time. The current structure of the institutions and the social psychology is set up to reinforce this particularly negative way of behaving. So where are the levers in the system? Where are the margins in the system to drive change? My experience with climate is that it's very helpful to have someone who is actually thinking about the good of the system and attempting to enact that in their corporation and in their relationships with government. There is, of course, an important role for a social and political movement that shifts the institutions which perpetuate the negative cycles in which we are. I put up the one slide on social movements to hint at that. The course I'm currently teaching goes through sector by sector in the economy. What are the structural moves you can make in business, in government, in the media, in education, in communities, in stakeholder relationships? Goes through those sectors, talking about what are the policy and structural changes we need, and then asking, can we find in each of those sectors leaders who are leading from both sides of themselves? And are those leaders actually catalysts for change? I am trying to persuade the students that becoming more aware of this part of yourself is not just so that you sleep better, although it does make you sleep better, but because it will make you a more effective leader in driving the structural changes we need. And forgive me, I should have opened. This to me is so obvious that we don't get there without structural change, but I should have started with it. I sort of did a little bit, but I didn't tie it well enough together. But that's my overall thinking. It's not like you go to yoga class and you're done. Absolutely not. Yes, sir.
Yes, Professor Henderson, as you've been teaching the
Who
default,
are you, sir?
Jack Fuchs, I'm a lecturer here. As you've been teaching the default mindset to your students, have you done any empirical evidence or studies or any research as to how what you're teaching has affected either their mindset or their actions?
What a great question. And one of my teaching fellows is a psychologist. So we gave them a carefully designed questionnaire at the beginning of the class, and we will administer the same instrument at the end of the class. This was just the first time through that I'm teaching it to a really big group. but we have a proposal into the IRB at the moment so that next year we have complete IRB clearance and we can do research on this. Because of course, and one would love to keep administrating that over many years, because this is a hypothesis, right? You know, I'm married to a realist. He's a dancing Brazilian, but he's also a professor of political science at Brown. And he's like, Rebecca, this stuff is cool, but he's completely with a nut. He's like, just tell me what the regulatory and policy changes are. To which I reply, and tell me how we're going to get them. So I think there's a deep interaction between holding yourself in a different way, shifting the values, and maybe beginning to shift at least parts of the society. Yeah. 50 seconds left. Very quick question, Ken?
Question. So I would think that if you're concerned that people running things in the business world have the wrong values, the more direct prescription for business educators would be we should try to educate them to have the right values. And we should view that as part of our mission to imbue them with that. And what you're doing is sort of circuitously via like, I will help people be more self-aware and reflective and things like that. And that will lead to them having the right values. And I'm curious why your approach is not just like, well, we need to come in and imbue in people a different culture than the culture of business that you're being very critical of. So I'm curious why not that move?
So I'm certainly up for doing that if we can think about ways to do it in effective ways. What I do in my own classroom is give them examples of alternatives. But as I understand it, there's a course here at Stanford where the faculty ask their students to write a paper called "Here is what I believe" or "Here is what I stand for." Is that not the case?
I think it is.
Yeah. Yeah, what I stand for. Yeah. Which is a way of it. That's a very default mode question, which is asking them, what does their deepest self want? Where is their deepest self trying to go? And I believe, for all kinds of reasons, including a fair amount of research, that that's a much better way to change minds than coming in and saying, I'm right, you're wrong, let me tell you why. Here are the values. And on that note, let me thank you very, very much.